Okay, so thank you for taking the time to join me in this interview. I just want to talk about the new show and how it came to be and where it's going in the future. Um, so so the first question is the name. How is it correctly pronounced?
This has been a point of contention when coming up with the original title, just because
Yeah.
it's so difficult. It's sort of like Les Miserables in a way. You know, a lot of people will say less miserable. So, um, yeah, it's pronounced Mascherato. So it's a hard C.
Okay.
SCH in Italian has a ska sound. So Mascherato, much like
Uh,
mask plus erato. So.
okay, and what does that? Is there a meaning to the word? Is it?
So that it literally means masked, but not physically just masked. It can also mean disguised, as in disguised intentions or hidden things as well. So
Oh, okay. So, and how does that? That obviously that links to the show about the idea of disguise and. Okay. And so how did it how did you two end up working together and coming up with the idea and how did that pan out?
Well, the idea is entirely down to Michael, but we got together. We were introduced to one another through a mutual acquaintance, and obviously
Okay.
he'd already had the project sort of up and running by that point, and I sort of just came in and wrote the script for him. But
hmm
he's got a very interesting story behind how Mascherato actually came about.
if you want sort of the behind the scenes before sort of James came into the picture, I essentially I was at Guildhall, finishing my undergrad degree and had some extra time and some, bubbling creative energy beneath the surface that needed to be expressed somehow. So I decided to write a show because I'd always loved Disney musicals growing up, as a kid, and were massively influential in terms of, I guess, my musical preferences. And so I decided to just write the show, come up with an original story that allowed for a really lush sort of orchestral sound.
Hmm.
And so I basically came up with the structure of the plot and figured out characters here and there. But I'm under no illusions how difficult it is to write a script. And I think there's a real danger of people assuming that it's an easy thing. But we've all seen shows that have great songs, but a terrible book, and just how poorly the whole project comes together. So I knew I needed somebody who could really, take it and breathe life into it. And so then I was introduced to James, who got the outline and then took it and just ran with it, adding additional characters, really breathing life into the story. And so it was it was really easy working relationship, I have to say, because
Yeah,
James, you work really fast, and I had everything already sort of ready to go on my end, so I didn't have to catch up with you.
yeah.
And then that's sort of how it came together. We just had this sort of back and forth, working things out from his end, then working things out from my end, and yeah, that's basically how the project came together.
So you it's been workshopped, hasn't it, in front of the show's been workshopped?
Yes, so that was workshopped at Guildhall with a student cast. I had won a grant from it was a partnership between the Barbican and Guildhall because they're attached.
Hmm.
And so it was a good chance to work out the material and see whether or not it was of quality, whether or not the songs or the story really worked. But more importantly, I think it was the pacing of it all. That was a really good indicator. Just because pacing is arguably one of the most important things.
Yeah.
And just seeing if it all flowed nicely. And we received a lot of positive feedback from that experience, which sort of helped reinforce our belief that this was something greater than just this one workshop and that we could push it to the next level and attempt to make something happen.
So for someone who doesn't know or isn't in the business, what does it mean to workshop a show?
Do you want to take this, James? Do you want me to keep rambling on?
So a workshop is basically you get the project right at its earlier stages when you've got sort of the rudiments of a script and the songs, and you get some actors. In this case, I think it was fellow students at Guildhall, and then you sort of do a rehearsed reading where like the actors have like few days to get acquainted with the script, the characters, and the songs. And then I think in your workshop you did invite some audience members in,
Yeah.
and then you do sort of a staged version of it. So then you can get
This was actually
reactions.
a slightly different version of a workshop than most, just because most of the time, as you said, sometimes you'll have actors reading off book, and then you'll have just a piano maybe sitting in the corner, whereas people can sing along. Whereas this was sort of treated almost like a fully staged concert, in which the actors were dressed. They had a few props they could move around stage with, and the music itself was already fully orchestrated out. So we had the full. It was a 17-piece orchestra behind the singers, which really, I think, was a great way to workshop it, because you can only get so much indication of how the score is going to sound from the piano. Whereas if you have the full palette of sound that you're going to end up using, it really helps with the scope and size, particularly due to the setting of the story and the need for something sort of larger than life.
Yeah, and that's something I actually noticed about the show. There's a focus on sort of the storytelling, atmosphere. Unlike shows that I know I personally seen before, it seems like this idea of taking the audience somewhere, making them feel like they are actually in with the place. The narrator. Oh, I think we've lost Michael.
Oh, no, I'm still here.
Oh, your video was just dropped now. Okay, that's
okay.
Oh.
The wonders of technology.
So, the narrator then. I read somewhere that wasn't a part of the original soundtrack, but included just for the obviously the sound available now.
Yeah, because like when we decided that we wanted to do a recorded version, we knew that we had to make it stand out from other recordings, and with all cast recordings, it's literally just the songs and some orchestration. That's it. But with this one, we wanted it to really stand out and do benefit to the story, so we decided to include the script as well. But if we included the entire script, it would have gone on a lot longer than it should. So in order to combat that problem, we decided to cut some scenes, reduce some characters, and so then in order to fill the gaps, we come up with the narrator, who I think does a really good job of helping, as you say, sweep the audience away into the streets of Venice and paint the picture.
Yeah, the tricky thing as well with having sort of too much dialogue without a visual stimulus to attach to it is that it's really easy for the energy to drag, even if it's a really great script, which it is. Just the fact that you don't get to see people moving around, their physicality, their actions, it feels a little bit like an audio book. And when you have such highs and lows already, to have something sort of stagnate, the flow would be interrupted, which is the reason as well that the narration helped push things forward, whereas the full stage version, obviously there's a lot more room for the actors to do what they're going to do when you can actually see it.
And you talked about the actual live production. Is that sort of in the works? Is there plans for
There are lots of people we're reaching out to. There's some things potentially in the works, but at the same time, it's keeping in mind that this show it's massive. And I think anyone who's been paying attention over the past, 10, 15 years knows that particularly in the West End, there's not a whole lot of new writing that's being put on, especially of a show this size. If anything, there's a lot of sort of fringe theater or smaller shows here and there, but more often than not, they don't have the room to grow that would necessitate the need for a West End stage. But at the same time, there's also not a direct pathway for a show of this size to get that way. More often than not, it's things that transfer from Broadway. So it's really a question of finding people to take a risk and who have enough sort of foresight to see what this could be, instead of necessarily picking something that might be cost effective in the sort of the immediate time, but actually thinking about where this could go and the spectacle and larger than life experience that a lot of people want from live theater.
So we actually haven't talked about the actual story of what happens within the musical. So for someone who hasn't listened to the musical, could you give a brief overview of the story?
That's you, James.
Thanks, Michael. So basically, it's set in the heart of 18th century Venice, just as the famous carnival is getting underway. And we have our two heroes, Luca and Elena, and they meet at the carnival and they fall in love. But just as they're about to sort of like accept their feelings for one another, they're ripped apart by war between the Ottoman Empire and Venice. And so Luca goes off to fight whilst Elena stays. But then Venice loses the war, and so the Ottomans take over, and Luca and Elena are never able to reunite, and sort of that's the rest of the story, them fighting against fate in order to reignite their love for one another and to escape the hold of the Ottoman Empire. So it's really
interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, carry on. Yeah.
It's really interesting to have war in a musical, because I know there's a few musicals that are based on it, but when you initially think about it, the upbeatness of a musical with songs and choreography almost clashes with the idea of war. Is it kind of just in the background of the show, or is it how does that function within the show?
I think what really interested me when Michael told me first about the story was that how the war sort of lands like a boulder into water. So everything sort of smooth sailing in the first half, and then suddenly you have the war erupt, and we're sort of wrenched into a different genre, and it just completely changes the story and the characters. You really see the effects of it in Act 2, which I think we don't really see it in other stories like this, where usually it's just a romance. We're just following Luca and Elena. Maybe they have a rival lover who turns up, and that causes a bit of hoo-ha, but never something of this magnitude, which really interested me and drew me to the script.
The thing I like about it as well is that it's not just a situational thing that happens. It's actually a stylistic shift that happens at this point. It's sort of all happy-go-lucky at the beginning of the first act, and then you reach this pivot point. And the whole idea was that you're essentially getting higher, happier, everything's going fine. You reach this point, and then the second act, everything gets continually darker. The music gets darker, the plot gets darker, until it reaches, obviously, that point.
Don't want to spoil,
No, of course not. It reaches that point, and then ... You have to listen to hear what happens.
Yeah.
So what's next for you two as a team? What's next for the show? Obviously, right now we're in unprecedented times and things like that. But what's the plans for the future for both the show and for you guys individually?
Well, as Michael said, we've sort of reached out to a few people, and there are sort of conversations bubbling away for Mascherato. So that's certainly got a future ahead of it, and sort of getting bigger and bigger as we reach out to different audiences. As for other projects, we do have a couple of things cooking away, but not big enough yet to talk about.
No, that's fair enough. But there are so if people enjoy the soundtrack, the show, there will be more projects coming from you two as the creative. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of all the questions I've got. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out to interview me.
Thank you.
Let me interview you. Sorry. And obviously the soundtrack to the show is available on all streaming sites, iTunes, Netflix.
Yeah. Not Netflix yet, but I mean, that would be a nice thing.
Yeah.
But so if they want to give it a listen, they can find it on wherever they find their music. And thank you very much for taking your time out.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.